In this video, I'm going to show you how to modify a Nektar SE61 to change it into a harpsichord keyboard controller. That means shifting the keys over from C to begin on F. So the first step is to take it apart, and what we find inside is that the controls are connected by one ribbon cable on the left. These are the pitch bend and mod wheel and buttons. And there is one main board which is connected to the keys with two ribbon cables. I'm going to remove the lowest octave of keys here because we need to figure out how we're going to start at F instead of at C. This particular action is similar to what you find in Yamaha keyboards. It's in three parts. They stack together. And each of these T-shapes is called a living hinge. It's this aspect of the design that allows us to reposition the keys. The action is regulated by a piece of felt at the bottom of the key travel. And this is also stopped by the circuit board itself, which has some protection on the top and the bottom. And the keys hook around the circuit board. So let's just position this first octave as if we had already cut it to begin at F, just to make sure that the keys are going to line up with the switch plungers underneath. And it looks like that's going to work fine. Once we position this properly, the remaining octaves shouldn't be hard to place because we've got this T-hook, which fits together like a puzzle. Now, each of these three pieces needs to be cut in a different place in between the living hinges. These hinges are extremely important, so when we make the cut, we need to make sure that we're not damaging the hinge. So it's just in between two hinges in each case, but they're in different places. These two little things at the edge don't do anything structurally. They're just there to help with assembly. So we'll probably remove those. So I've determined the places where these layers need to be cut, and then it can begin here. Now the problem is there are two problems with mounting this. First is these are not going to clip in here if we leave this as it is, and the holes aren't lining up. So we could just move this over like so and drill new holes. And what that is this has been made very economically so that the screws are accepted by these little holes, these pockets for the screws. In other words, just drilling a hole, we're drilling in a very thin material. There's not enough material there for arbitrary drilling to be very stable. It would work, but I'd say we could do that if all of this were cut off and some other material is put here, a piece of wood. That would work. Before I take this into the shop to do that, I just want to cover up this piece of felt so that it doesn't get sawdust and plastic dust caught in it, because that will ruin the action of the keyboard. Here I'm showing, this is my plan for the main board. But it can be folded under the keys as long as I can remove enough material from the body. I'm going to cut a hole here and mount the circuit board underneath. And then I'll cut off this left edge. So I've done that here. You can see the left side of the keyboard is gone. And all that's left is sort of the plastic that's needed to support the keys. Let me just show you how that the circuit board fits into that space. On the other side, it will be mounted with a couple of standoffs. I had to remove some of the structural material here, but this didn't change the rigidity of the keyboard at all. It's time to make those cuts on the keys themselves. And for this, I use the bandsaw, which makes a very clean cut and doesn't put stress on the plastic. By the way, I had used the bandsaw to cut the body. I just forgot to film that part. If you're using a hacksaw or some other handsaw, you need to be careful that you're not going to damage those living hinges. So once all these cuts are made, you got a lot of pieces here, and you'll have to fumble around with them to figure out how they fit back together, because it seems like it should be easy, but it isn't. It's like a 3D jigsaw puzzle. You've got parts that are stacking up and that need to interlock. So here I'm just putting the octave back together to show how the cuts are in two different places there on the white layers, and of course the black layers go on top, so that's easy. But the thing fits together in a way that is not at all intuitive because we had to cut it in 3 different places. So now that we have our two keyboard halves, our 2 octave halves, we can go back to the body of the keyboard and make sure that everything's going to line up. Starting at F, connecting to the next octave is no problem. And then there will be 4 more octaves to connect to the C at the top. But the keyboard doesn't end there. There's one more key. This will now be an F, but you notice there's a problem now because this hinge is in the way, the hinge for the E key. So we got to find a solution here. This hinge is very important, and you can't just cut it off because the key would no longer flex properly. So the obvious solution is we've got to remove material from both keys. Here I've marked what's going to be removed. You can see that most of the hinge is still there. Well, half of each side. And here it is with that material removed, and the hinge still looks okay. It's pretty thick plastic, so it's still going to last a lifetime. And now these 2 pieces fit side by side the way that they should. So the whole thing looks pretty good. And on the left side, we do have a similar situation, but we're not going to cut this off. Just leave that there. Here I'm showing you the piece of wood that I've put in place of those poles on the underside of the body, so that when we drill new holes, the screws will have something to hold on to. To mount the circuit board on the bottom, I'm using 2 5mm standoffs. So here I'm just marking where the standoffs are so that I can drill holes into the body in the right place. And at this point, you can see the switch circuit board underneath, but I've removed it here. So when I'm drilling, I am not drilling into the circuit board. And I'm also not drilling into my finger, although that's what it looks like here. Ouch. I also didn't drill into the table. It's all camera angles. Now this should be easy, but as you may or may not know, nothing is easy. I had to work a little magic here. Oh, nobody's ever going to see this, except you, of course. This is underneath the switch circuit board, and once it's there, it's solid. So I'm putting the screws back in for the switch circuit board just to test everything. You notice I'm doing this by hand, and also that I put the screws in a zigzag pattern, which is also how you should take them out, because you want the stress on the circuit board to remain as uniform as possible at all times. Now this board does flex a little bit here at the edge, so I added 2 more standoffs. These are 15 millimeters. On the left side, there's no problem. On the right side, I had to remove some of the wood in order to get the standoff to be level. And once it's there, everything's really solid now. I just want to check this last key to make sure that it's going to be mounted in the right place. Now, I'm using as a guide the hole that was already there in the body, and then I'm drilling very carefully here because this screw is just there to hold the key in place. It shouldn't be too tight, and I really should have screwed it in by hand. It looks fine. Looks like it's in the right place. Didn't split the wood. Looks like the action is okay. Everything seems to be fine, but when we place these keys next to it, I noticed that there's a problem. This plunger has no clearance. So this is in the wrong place. The hole that was there in the body is not the hole that we need to use for the screw that's going to mount this last key. So here I'm just testing. I've moved it over a few millimeters, and indeed that's what has to happen in order for us to have clearance here, which means you got to move this hole over a couple of millimeters. And this is the worst kind of problem. You'll notice that's what happens every time the drill bit slips into the existing hole. So now what I've got is 2 holes side by side, a few millimeters apart, and I just need to make sure that I use the right one when I mount that final key. Once I do that, I've got the clearance that's needed there. Now that looks correct. But I just want to check with the remaining octaves below to make sure there's nothing funny going on here, that each next key has enough clearance, and so far so good. When we insert the final octave, we see that everything lines up perfectly. So the keys on the left are also in the right position. So looking down into each mounting hole, the camera is misleading here because none of the holes line up. So I'm going to have to mark new places to drill, and it's impossible to do that with a center punch. I am not drilling into the plastic here. What I'm doing is just very lightly making a mark with the drill bit so that I can then remove the keys and then drill a hole. To begin with, I'm just using 1 screw here to make sure that I can hold this in place in the right place. But of course, every octave or partial octave is going to require 2 screws in order to be stable. That looks pretty good. I've done the rest of the keyboard with 2 screws per octave, 1 at each end, and left the middle empty for now. There is a little problem here at the left side because of this weird sandwich. This screw is trying to clamp the top layer down on the bottom one with nothing in between. So we've got to fix this. What needs to happen, obviously, is we need to put some material in between these 2 layers. And the question is, what should that be? And I could use a piece of wood, but looking at this, I've got enough material up here at the top that we could simply cut out a piece and move it over and put it in there. So that's what I did. And it's just going to fit right there. And I just used some super glue here, glued it to the middle layer. And when we sandwich the 3 layers back together, then that's going to give us the stability we need. Just got to give clearance for the mounting screw, and everything looks good. These are the kinds of little unexpected challenges you run into when you do this kind of work, and it looks really good now. So I'm satisfied with that. I'm going to test the action at this point. All the octaves are in place. This is how the keyboard is going to feel. So this is important. And of course, we also need to check the electronics at this point. The rest of the video is about converting this keyboard into something that looks like it's completely made out of wood. The body is going to be made of solid wood, and the key tops will also be real wood, but the core of the keyboard is still plastic, and the keys themselves are, of course, plastic. So it's partly an illusion, and to help with that illusion, one of the things that I do is I paint the white keys black. Here are some pictures of other keyboards that I've converted using this same method. And one of the things you may notice is that the white keys underneath the wood veneer are no longer white. They're black. And it's mostly not paint. In fact, because if you've ever tried to paint plastic with a brush, you know that it doesn't really work over large areas. So what I use is this tape. Now this is polyethylene tape that has a natural rubber adhesive, which is very strong. And I use this to cover the majority of the area. And then I use the paint basically to fill in the gaps. And touch-up work is done using a permanent marker. And some other tools you want to have are a pair of scissors, an X-Acto knife, a ruler, the thicker the better, because you don't want to cut yourself when you're using the X-Acto knife. And you need some wax paper to lay down the tape in order to cut it. You can't cut directly into this tape. The adhesive just gets all over the scissors. So what I use is old label paper. I just peel off whatever's there, and that works like wax paper. So here are some keys that have been covered with the tape. And you can see that shapes need to be cut so that they fit the key shape, but it doesn't need to be perfect. There's a lot of white around the corners and the edges and in between. So that gets painted over. And once it's been painted, it looks like this. This doesn't need to be perfect. You can see that, in fact, you can do this pretty sloppily, and it's not going to be a problem. This paint is dry, but you can see where I use too much. And there are places where there isn't enough. So any of those little spots that are still where the white shows through, just touch those up with a permanent marker. So you will want to invest in some high quality permanent markers. The results look pretty good. The black keys are already black, so we don't need to paint them, but there's another problem. I've marked these where I'd like to shorten them. Hey everybody, it's me just a little bit later, and I realize what I call a problem here really isn't a problem. It's just something that bothers me. So it may not bother you. Obviously, you can do this kind of project without shortening the black keys. Now the thing is, these keys are 8.5 centimeters long, which the length of these keys varies from one keyboard to another, but for my taste, they're just a little bit too long for a harpsichord. Of course, that's a matter of opinion. But I made this jig so that I could shorten these keys. It's just made out of plywood and cheap wood and some pieces of aluminum. And what this will allow me to do is to position the keys securely so that I'm not going to damage any of the hinges. So when I cut into these with the Dremel tool, the metal pieces are there to keep me from cutting too deep into the plastic so that I don't damage the keys. The hinges themselves are protected with this much larger piece of aluminum. And this just ensures that the cutting tool is not going to come in contact with the hinge at all. Then a bar across the tops of the keys ensures that I'm going to cut them all in the same place. Now, I want to be sure not to cut at steep angles. There is going to be a little bit of an angle. And you'll see when I make the first cut that it's not completely perpendicular. But that's unavoidable because of the tool. Of course, when I cut into the key with this rapidly rotating tool, the plastic melts. And this is the problem that is avoided by making many short motions back and forth like this, rather than trying to cut off one big piece at a time. So what happens if you do that is you get a big glob of molten plastic and probably some structural damage. But many shorter motions mean that the temperature is much lower, you're not melting the plastic as much, and the structure is going to remain intact. So that's why this raking motion is better than trying to cut it all at once, even though it's much more time consuming. Of course, no matter how cleanly the work has been done, there's an awful lot of cleanup work to be done using the X-Acto knife, and most of it I'm not showing here. So after removing the piece from the jig, a lot of extra plastic has to be removed before it looks like this. But basically this is what you get, which looks pretty good. And now the keys are 1 centimeter shorter. So I've got black keys that are 7.5 centimeters long. You put it all together, this is what it looks like. Whether that's better, it's just personal preference. So now I'm measuring the white keys in relation to these new black keys, and it's about 12.5 centimeters. So with some play at the end, it'll be 13. Doing some quick arithmetic, we've got 35 white keys plus 1 at the end is 36. For 13 centimeters each gives us 468 centimeters. So we need 5 meters of wood laminate. Now I live in Germany, and you'd think I'd be able to find this pretty easily here, but I haven't been able to. So I get this from eBay from the UK, and the price isn't bad. It's walnut, and this is what it looks like. 22 millimeters wide, which just happens to be the average width of a piano key. 13 centimeter segments. Once these have been marked, you just cut them with a pair of scissors. You want to keep these in order, or actually you don't have to, but I think it looks better if you keep the keys in order so that from one key to the next it's a continuous piece of laminate. The first few keyboards I didn't make them that way, and I don't know, I like it either way. But here, where the keys are interlocked, this creates an interesting problem because you've got to sort out the order in a kind of back and forth so that these interlocking keys are in the correct sequence. So here I am first putting them in order. In terms of actually making the bond between the laminate and the plastic, there's nothing to it. I mean, you hold an iron on it. But I found that starting at the end and fixing the end in the right position is a good strategy, and it keeps the rest of the piece in place, usually. One of the things that happens pretty often is if you place the entire iron over it like this, that you have to hold it there for, 15 seconds or something. And what happens is the piece will skid like this, and you have to reposition it really quickly before the glue starts to cool. This is for the black keys. It's white beech, and these are 8 millimeters wide. So you have to cut them, especially from the 22 millimeters. You'll get only 2 out of each piece. And the order doesn't really matter because the grain just isn't that noticeable. It does make a small difference. Since I'd made a jig, I used it here, which helped a lot actually, made it go pretty quickly. So again, the trick is to get each piece in place by ironing on just one end of it. And the jig helps a lot here because all of them can then be ironed onto at once like this. And as long as you don't leave the iron sitting there too long, things aren't going to skid around. So this went really quickly actually. Now, what you'll find is that these edges of all of these laminates are very uncomfortable for your fingertips. So you want to sand every edge, and this makes it comfortable to play. Otherwise, your fingers are not going to be happy with this laminate. Trust me. It doesn't take much. I use 120 for this. Getting back to the body of the keyboard, I determined that the smaller board needed to be connected to the main board. So I had to cut out a space for that and mount it underneath. The reason being that if it's not connected, the main board will send out random CCs. Here's a funny mistake I made. You'll notice that the foot there is in the wrong place because the force is beyond it. So that needs to be moved over. So I did that. Here are a few mock-ups of the keyboard with the wood that I'm going to use to make the body. It's just 5 pieces of wood. Front, back, side to side, and 1 piece on the top. Whenever you do a project like this and there's a panel, be sure to save the original piece because you know that it fits perfectly. And you can just use that as a stencil. And that way you don't have to measure anything. It's a huge time saver. And just outline the shapes and then mark wherever you need to drill holes to take away material. I'm just marking where I'm going to drill holes. And then after drilling, I use the Dremel tool to remove the material from the inside. Of course, this is just the first step. There's a lot of material that has to be taken out, but just checking it's basically correct. Now the piece on the side looks like it's flush, but there's a lot of material that has to be taken out in order for it to appear as if it is simply flush with the left edge. Back in the workshop, I've got the body connected to 2 pieces of wood here in an L shape, and these 2 pieces are glued together, and there are 2 screws connecting the body to the rightmost piece. And you'll see that there are also 2 pieces of aluminum supporting the body in the middle so that it doesn't bend. The main board is attached because I need to make sure that the back of the body is going to fit that. This piece of cardboard is a stand-in for the circuit board for the keys because dust would ruin that. So I mentioned a moment ago that these 2 pieces are glued together, and on the left side this piece is made to look like it's also glued together, but it isn't. There's an L-shaped piece in there, which allows the 2 pieces of wood to fit together without being glued together. But from the side, it looks like the pieces are glued together when they're not. So that's just a little trick. There's a name for that. I can't remember what it is at the moment. But as you can see, I need to check to make sure when this is in place that the clearance is correct for the key bed there. Otherwise it's not going to work. The body of the keyboard is attached to the left side also with 2 screws the same way that it's fastened to the right side. So this looks pretty convincing. You're not going to see the bottom of the keyboard. I brought along the keys themselves for the right and left edges to make sure that nothing I did during this process would interfere with the movement of those keys, since we are talking about millimeters here that are needed for clearance. It was a trade-off because, of course, these keys got dusty, but it doesn't really matter. I just had to be kind of careful that because they're wobbly, that the hinges didn't get damaged. The circuit board actually fits into this back piece. I had to take out quite a bit of material to get that to work. Everything's in order. The only thing is that this back piece is so thin that it's not flush. So I'm going to use this little angle bracket to fix this piece to the back, to that piece of wood that I added in the back, and that will keep it in place. So once that's there, you can see that the whole thing is pretty sturdy now, and it looks much better. This was originally the piece I was going to use for the top, and you can see how incredibly thin it is here. That's like 1.5 millimeters on either side, which really didn't work. You can see it's splintered. I just was removing way too much material from that. Luckily, I had another piece of wood at hand that was at the same length. In fact, had been cut from the same piece of wood as had the back of the keyboard. And I was able to use this, cutting it more reasonably as the top. You can see that it fits perfectly. All of this wood, by the way, is rubber wood, and the original stock is actually made for countertops. So it's really good to work with, and it's not going to bow or warp very easily, and it's just a beautiful grain. You'll notice that some of the pieces here have been partially finished, and that's just because this whole project is made from scrap pieces. This is the back, which I ended up having to glue together to make it taller, and this is the kind of odd-looking profile that you come up with when you don't plan your projects well enough. The back of the keyboard, I wanted to have a lip on it so that when I toss a pencil onto the top of the keyboard, it wouldn't roll away. That's the idea. Basically, this is the design of the keyboard, is these two L shapes that fit together. Here I'm just going to assemble it. Basically, 2 screws on each side, and the back is attached to the left side because of the inputs and outputs. And also because of that bracket, which has to keep the back in place. So that's the left L shape once this screw is in place. And then this will connect to the right L shape as a dry fit, basically. There's no glue. And of course, that means I can take it apart if I need to. Once these L shapes are connected, it's just a matter of these 2 screws on either side that are fastening the plastic body to the wood, and that holds the whole thing together. Let's add the keys. This project is close to being done. We need to finish the wood and wax the keys. Each time I change the lighting in the room, I notice little places that need some attention. But this is what it looks like when it's all ready. Now for the finishing touch, the wax for the wood and the keys. This comes in a lot of different types, so be sure you get the right kind. You need to shake it up, get yourself some gloves, and the material needs to be free of loose threads and tiny fibers that are going to get into the wood. You want to wipe the wax on in a very thin layer and then use very fine sandpaper to buff it in between. So it's wax and buff, and you do that 3 times at least. And you do the same thing with the wood. Whether or not you're going to see it, all surfaces have to be waxed. And this is the sandpaper that I use. Be sure to open a window when you do this. So here's what it looks like after a couple of coats. The wax is still a little bit wet here. You have to wait 4 hours in between each coat. If you have a free day, you can get a couple done. And of course, even at this point, you're going to find places that need touching up. These are the final touches. We're not quite done because these circuit boards are exposed underneath. So I took a piece of aluminum and bent the edges around to cover this up. Needed a little height in order to manage the ribbon cables. And with that in place, we're really good to go here. The top panel, I added some damping material to reduce the possible key noise and also to keep it in place more securely. And here we are at last. The keyboard is in its new home. This is a standing desk that I built for myself for my daily work and for composing.